Welcome to the Ducks Unlimited podcast, the only podcast about all things waterfowl. From hunting insights to science-based discussions about ducks, geese, and issues affecting waterfowl and wetlands conservation in North America, we bring the resource to you. The DU Podcast with your host, Chris Jennings.
Joining me today is Ducks Unlimited magazine shotgunning columnist Phil Bergeli. Phil, welcome back to the show.
Hey, thanks for having me.
And I wanted to bring Phil on to the DU podcast today to discuss something that's becoming an ever-increasing trend, and it is the 20-gauge duck gun. More and more hunters out there are using the 20-gauge. Things have changed. I know Phil and I have talked. He's starting to use a 20-gauge, but, you know, Phil, you wrote a column a couple years back just on that fact, the 20-gauge duck gun. And so what were some of the first things that you kind of recognized as you started to see this transition, or as it came about, that people started using these 20 gauges and why?
We in the United States have always liked small gauge guns. We're unique in that in the world. Most people shoot 12 gauges for everything. But we have always liked small gauge guns. And I just think as guns and ammunition and chokes have gotten better, people see that they can shoot a 20. Anytime I see a change like this, I just assume it's because hunters are getting older and weaker and fatter, and they want smaller guns. I know that's not true. I know there's a lot of younger people who shoot 20s too, but that's always the first thing I think about. When I wrote that column, actually, the phenomenon I was looking into then was there are several clubs in California that require 20 gauges. They believe, besides that it cuts down on long shots, they also think that the slightly quieter report of the 20 gauge actually helps them hold ducks better on their clubs. You know, they're convinced of it, or they've convinced themselves of it, one or the other. Yeah. But those are kind of the two reasons that, you know, from a management standpoint, that these clubs have done that, and it seems to work for them. They have great hunting out there, but in general, I think people say we like small gauge guns in the United States, and if it's one of these things where if we can shoot a duck, or you're seeing a lot of 20 gauges in the turkey woods now too. If you can shoot a turkey with a 20 gauge, people want to do it. People think it's fun.
Yeah, and one thing, our one of our editors in the past had talked about he switched to a 20 gauge because of a health issue. He had surgery, and he was like, I'm going to step down to this 20 and see if, he notices a big difference. And one thing with that, it's not necessarily the recoil changing as much, but it's the light of the weight of the gun being so much lighter that he could kind of get it up to his shoulder in a little, and I see here a lot of people doing that. So maybe it is, some people are getting older and they want to switch, or, you blame it on people getting older and fatter. And I always blame it on the marketing machine of the waterfowl community. These massive marketing geniuses that some of these gun companies have really pumped this out.
Yeah, we do have to sell more guns to the same people because they're not making that many more hunters these days. There is that aspect of it. What I find with the 20 gauge, and I've been shooting a couple different ones this season so far, it's not so much the weight, as there are some really light 12 gauges now too. It's how trim the guns are. That's what's kind of fun about them. They're just not as big around. And so it's an easy gun to shoot, I think. And this was like an experiment for me this year. I just thought I was going to do all my hunting with 20 gauge and probably do all my bird hunting with 20 gauges too. I'll probably go back to my 12s when this is over. But I am enjoying it now. I've got a Benelli M2 that I've been hunting with lately, and it's a fun gun to shoot.
Yeah, that M2 is very popular. A lot of the guys that I hunt with shoot that gun, and most of them won't shoot anything else. I mean, they swear by it. And I have a 20 gauge that I got when I was 12 years old. It's a little Mossberg 20 gauge pump, and I shoot that quite a bit still to this day. I've talked about that on some past podcasts. That's kind of my go-to. I go back to it on occasion, but I also shoot an A400 light. It's a Beretta's version. That is. I think that gun weighs, right at 6 pounds. Like you said, it is very slim. It is very light. It is, easy to handle. For me, it's a great gun in the flooded timber. It's just ideal.
Sure. And waterfowl hunting, whether it's in the timber or in the little pond that I'm hunting, if you do it right, it's more of a 25-yard game than it is a 40-yard game. We all obsess on the long range patterns and the 90% at 40 yards and that kind of thing. But really, if you shoot your ducks and geese over decoys, their shots are pretty close. At least that's the shots I like to take are close. Those are the shots that make it fun. And for that, a 20 gauge is totally fine. That it's those where it gets into a gray areas when you get a really windy day and those second and third shots as birds are flaring out. So you have to be restrained. You have to make your shots count. But I've had no problem shooting ducks this year, and actually had shot a double on a couple of Canada geese that came into my decoys the other day, and that was no problem. So I'm enjoying this experiment. It's fun.
Yeah, that was going to be my next question to ask you. Is I know that you prefer, that during the late season you prefer that we had the conversation that you prefer the 10 gauge, and now you're going to go from a 10 to the 20. That's a pretty big step. You're taking quite a leap. Are you going to late season Canada goose hunt with the 20 this year?
I'm gonna try it for a while. I'm kind of excited to have this new 10 gauge. It's just like I have too many guns and not enough birds to shoot them at. So I'm kind of excited about shooting that 10 because that particular one is new to me. But yeah, I will try it. I won't. This is not something. If I think it's not working, I'm not going to keep shooting birds with a gun that I don't think is adequate. But especially if I'm hunting by myself and picking the shots that I want, which is a lot of times how I hunt, I have quite a bit of confidence that 20 gauge is going to be an adequate goose gun for me. Not great. The birds I shot the other day, they were close enough I could head shoot them both, and so that you can do with any gun. But then I have some ones, and I've got some non-toxics too. I've got some old Remington Wingmaster HD 4s that I know will be a fine goose load. But part of this too is I want to shoot what my readers can shoot. So I'll be shooting the 1s and 2s and that kind of thing, and see how those do on geese. But if I think it's not working, I'll pick up the 10 gauge. In fact, I may bring the 10 gauge with me to the field just in case. Just in case it turns out to be one of those days, because I don't want to. This is not something where I want to cripple birds just to see if I can shoot them with a little gun.
Yeah, no, and that that's something that people need to keep in mind is just doing it just to do it is one thing, but if you're put in a situation like you said on a windy day, or ducks or geese aren't quite committing to the decoys the way you should, that's something to keep in mind with the 20. If you're sitting there with a 20, maybe you don't take that shot. It's something to be a little bit more cautious about. But you kind of hinted on it, and this is my next question for you. Things have changed drastically as far as ammunition, non-toxic options for smaller gauges. And, do you think that leads to the popularity of this, is that some of these manufacturers are getting so much better at creating a much better 20 gauge load?
I do think so. I think the comeback of bismuth, I think, has been a big part of it, because it's not as, some of the tungsten stuff is such, you could shoot it. You could shoot TSS and kill ducks at 60 yards with a 20 gauge, but at $10 a shell, most of us won't. And that includes me. But the price of bismuth has come down a little bit. I've been shooting bismuth 3s, and they've been working really well for me. So I think that is part of it. And the steel loads are better now too. You give up velocity usually in those. Because there's only so much you can put into one of those hulls, and only so high you can raise pressures and so on. And I'm not a big fan of velocity anyway, so I don't really feel like I'm giving up much there. So then it really is, it's more like an eighth or a quarter of an ounce of pellet count is what you're giving up. And also, in a 20 gauge hull, you can't load them with BBs and triple Bs, and they just don't hold very many.
Yeah.
The capacity is better for smaller shots. So there's limitations to it, but I do think that the ammunition is a lot better. To get back to this Benelli I'm shooting, it's one of those performance shop guns, and it came with a couple custom choke tubes in it. And the patterns I shot with them are really, really good. And I think that's part of it too. That's really impressed and be totally confident in shooting at a 35, 40 yard duck. I won't do it. I hope not to do it, but pretty sure I could, having seen what these things look like on paper.
Yeah, and I'm just going to assume that you're shooting one of the Rob Roberts Performance.
Mm-hmm. It's a T2. Yep. And I haven't even tried the tight choke yet because the medium range, the T2, is so good. And because also I hunt mostly on a little pond, and actually this year it's really little because we don't have any water. And it's a funny year. I will stare at the sky and see no ducks anywhere, and then the few ducks I do see are just there. They are over the decoys. They're seeing this little scrap of water from wherever, and I don't really see them until they're backpedaling. So it's worked out really well. Those are the shots I'm getting. Those are the shots I want. And for that, the 20 gauge is just fine. What do you like for ammunition? You say you've been shooting a 20 forever. You're like an early adopter.
As an early adopter, I was one of the original. I always shot steel, and a lot of that was just a cost. And I think any 2s to 4s, I would shoot Canada geese on a regular basis with a steel 2. And not blink an eye. But again, like you mentioned, it's one of those things where I wasn't taking 35-yard shots. I was taking 20, 25-yard shots on Canadas. So,
and a 2 is my favorite. When I shoot, where I hunt, there's always a pretty good chance of geese, as well as ducks. And so I steel 2s are pretty much, for me, the all-around waterfowl load. And I don't think that changes if you go to a 20 gauge, except that then you either need to choke tighter or take closer shots just so you don't run out of pattern density when you get out to longer ranges. But and my kids, I started both of them off with 2 3/4 inch 20 gauge Youth 1100s, because those are the softest shooting semi-autos I could find. And I wanted them to shoot a lot when they were young so they could hit what they shot at when they went hunting. And we shot, so that's like a 3/4, 7/8 ounce, a 3/4 ounce load. I think a lot of them. And I forget now, but we shot 3s and 4s out of those guns, and they had no trouble killing ducks. And we were calling shots for them really close through all those years of youth hunting, but it was not a problem.
Yeah, and I in my 20 gauge, I've always shot a modified, and I do the same now. With some of the newer, more highly advanced guns that I'm shooting, like I said, the A400 light, it's just a modified choke, factory choke. It's nothing special. And it patterns very well, especially even out to 35, 40 yards. I'm fairly confident with that gun. Once I get out that far, I'm usually shooting a higher end non-toxic shot though. I shot, multitudes of different ammo. But just recently that Boss 20 gauge is a really nice load, the copper plated. Kent offers some really, really good bismuth loads at a reasonable price. I shoot a lot of those, and then when I go to a 12, I'll shoot the Kent and the Boss as well. It's they seem to pattern well. I know a lot of guys say switch to a full choke with some of those. I haven't noticed that much of a difference staying with the modified, even with the 20 gauge. So
what I see with bismuth is usually it patterns about like lead used to, or maybe a little bit more open than that. You're making up for that because you've got extra pellets. You're using smaller shot and extra higher pellet counts, so you can still get a pretty dense pattern out of it. And so I've been shooting Rio 3s is what I've been shooting.
Oh, okay.
So far, and they've been working really well.
As people, get these new 20 gauges, do you recommend like going through a whole host of different ammos, or do you recommend, as far as patterning and getting accustomed to this new 20 gauge, do you recommend people, hey, go with what you're used to and start with that and see how it works? Or, are you recommend people kind of start from scratch as from a ballistic standpoint?
It's always my default to tell people to start with what they've got, because sometimes what you've got is just fine. In fact, before you run out and spend a bunch of money on choke tubes, try the tubes that come with the gun. Some of those work pretty well. And then if you're not happy with that, you can go out and start spending money on custom chokes and whatever else you want. I say the ones in this gun I've been shooting are terrific. They would be worth that extra money. But yeah, you should always start with what you're used to, and take it from there. Although for some people, part of the fun certainly is trying all of the different loads, seeing what works the very best. You can get way too caught up in it, but
waterfowlers have a tendency to get caught up in that. But
they do.
But that's what keeps the engine rolling.
Mm-hmm.
One more question for you, and this is almost like a personal question. I shoot a 26-inch barrel on my 20 gauges, and I don't know if that's just because that's what I was accustomed to. Like I said, with that old Mossberg that I shoot, it's always had a 26-inch barrel, and I prefer that over a 28. Is your M2 a 28?
It is, and then the other gun I've got, which I have not hunted, I'll be taking tomorrow morning, is a CZ Redhead over under, and that's got 30-inch barrels. It feels like a target gun, and it's except that it only holds 2 shells. I'm pretty excited about shooting it. I tend to prefer longer barrels just because I spend time target shooting, and I like that feeling in a waterfowl gun. Mm-hmm. But I say that, and then I'll pick up a gun with 26-inch barrels and enjoy shooting it too. So some of that is in my mind. But
yeah, I was getting ready to ask you, like, what is the main difference there, other than 2 inches?
The main difference is just a little bit, well, you're 2 inches closer to the duck, of course. But no, the main difference is just the balance and the feel of it, and a little extra weight forward, I think, makes a gun swing better. That is the main thing to me. But again, we're talking the shots we're talking about. When you're taking 25-yard shots at ducks that are hanging over the decoys or just starting to come out of the decoys, it's not that, like I say, it's not that hard a shot because we can all miss them, but it's not one that takes a whole lot of swing and momentum to the gun. It's a pretty easy shot to make if you just point at their heads and pull the trigger.
Yeah, and is there anything that you change about your approach as far as your blind bag and things like that? When you switch to the 20 from the 12 or the 10, I guess, do you have like a separate blind bag with just 20, or is there, with different tools and things like that? Is there any, almost like on the accessory side that you have to modify the way you approach the hunt?
I don't. I just make sure that when I'm done shooting a 20 gauge, all the 20 gauge shells are far away from my bag so that I don't wind up dropping one into a 12 gauge. Yeah. That is the safety aspect of mixing 12s and 20s, or even hunting with people with different gauge guns that you always have to keep in mind, is that 20 gauge shell drops right down into the chamber of a 12 and then sticks in the forcing cone when it gets to the main bore, and then you load a 12 gauge shell after it, and then you blow up your gun. Yeah. Which, we don't want to do that. So yeah, I have to be careful about that when I am loading and unloading my pockets and my bags, and just make sure, and make sure if I've got shells in the loops of my waders that I take them all out, because those are usually ones I grab in a hurry to shoot at cripples. And so I don't want to be, if I decide I want to go back to a 12 gauge, I want to make sure that I'm not grabbing 20 gauge shells out of my wader loops in a hurry. Yeah. So that to me is the main concern. Otherwise, I do carry, a lot of times I'll take a cleaning rod to the field in case I get an obstruction or a wad or something. So and I usually don't even have a brush on that, but if I did, I'd want to make sure I had the right size brush. Yeah. But other than that, no, just got to be careful with the ammunition, because there is a safety concern there.
Yeah, I've noticed that on occasion, and not very often, but I have run into the problem shooting the 20 gauge, especially with a group. The unfortunate thing is you better bring enough ammo, because if you run out, you're sitting there watching everybody else shoot. I've actually done that before, where I forgot my blind bag and I had a handful of shells. I was like, I'll be all right, and ended up running out of ammo. And then I'm like, oh, has anybody got any shells? And I thought, oh man, I'm the only one sitting here shooting a 20 gauge. So I'm out of luck.
Yeah, there is that.
Hey, are there any modifications that you would not recommend with someone switching to a 20 gauge? Like, we've kind of talked about personalizing and doing different modifications to your gun. Is there anything that when you switch to a 20 or someone else out there that you would say, hey, I probably wouldn't recommend you going to either the butt pad or, anything like that?
I can't think of anything off the top of my head. It's still a duck gun and still works the same way. It's just a little smaller. I'm not personally a fan of accessories like enlarged bolt handles, but we've talked about that's not really a gauge dependent thing. I think you might want to think, and you discover this in your preseason patterning, you might want to think a little bit about your choking. It may be different than what you're used to with a 12 gauge. You may want, if you think you're shooting farther or need extra pattern density, you might be tightening a choke or making an adjustment that way in terms of accessories. But otherwise, no, they're guns. They're just a little smaller. They still work.
Yeah. Yeah. I think my last question here is really, with more and more people going out and buying 20 gauges and switching to these smaller gauges, you had written a column on, buying used guns and what duck hunters should kind of look for when they're buying a used gun. And I thought that'd be a good topic to touch on. Just, somebody's out looking for a 20 gauge. What are some things that you would recommend they look for?
Oh, I was going to say, that means you can pick up people's cast off 12 gauges cheap.
Yeah, that's right.
Let them switch to a 20, you buy their old gun. But trying to think about, they say there are a lot more waterfowl, dedicated waterfowl type 20s on the market now. I have, my, this Benelli I've got in the CZ, these are both loaners. My personal guns, I've got an old Beretta 390, which is a great gun, and a 20 gauge Express 870. What I guess I find when you're looking for a small gauge gun, don't wait around. They go fast. They always go faster than the 12s.
Yeah.
If you see one, just the other day, my local store got in one of those old Special Field 1100s, those straight grip, short barreled bird guns. They're cool guns from the 80s. And if I had a reason to buy it, I would have bought it. And if I was going to buy it, I would have bought it as soon as I saw it, because it had come in the day before to the store. I saw it, and the next time I was in there, it was gone. People grab 20 gauges. So if you see one you like, go ahead and get it. You probably won't have any trouble selling it if you decide you don't like it. But if you're looking for a 20, don't wait around.
Yeah, that's a very good point. With as hot as 20 gauges are, jump on it if you find one. And, and also with everyone switching to the 20 gauge, that's a good point. You could probably get a little bit of a discount on a 12 that somebody's putting away.
Well, yeah, you look at, especially if you look at some older collectible guns, you'll spend a lot of money on a 20 gauge small gauge Model 12 or Browning Superpose or something like that. And the 12 gauges tend to be bargains. So, and this is a whole different conversation we're starting now, but yeah, you find people's cast off 12s and buy those, and don't feel sorry for yourself that you're not shooting a 20 gauge.
There you go. Well, hey, Phil, this has been a great conversation on 20 gauges. The popularity continues to grow with these small gauges, and it's awesome to have you on and kind of just talk about some of the different things that even you switching to a 20 gauge this year. It's a very timely conversation. Yeah,
it's fun. Yeah, I've enjoyed it. I will continue to enjoy it. I am kind of eager to get that 10 gauge out at the very end of the year, though.
He's still itching with the 10 gauge. That's awesome.
I am.
Hey, Phil, thanks for joining me today.
Hey, thank you.
I'd like to thank my guest, Ducks Unlimited Magazine shotgunning columnist Phil Bergeli, for joining me today to talk about 20 gauges. I'd also like to thank our producer, Clay Baird, for putting together the podcast and getting it out to you. And I'd like to thank you, the listener, for joining us on Ducks Unlimited Podcast and supporting wetlands conservation.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the DU Podcast. Be sure to rate, review, and subscribe to the show, and visit www.ducks.org/DU Podcast for resources based on today's topics, as well as access to more episodes. Opinions expressed by guests do not necessarily reflect those of Ducks Unlimited. Until next time, stay tuned to the Ducks.